lately I've become interested in structures of feeling, soft structures of feeling, and or affect and civic engagement. And so this is what I would like to focus on today through going over some conducting with colleagues at the University of Illinois in Chicago on structures of feeling on Twitter. So with my colleagues, we've been tracking sentiment expression on prominent hashtags on Twitter, including Egypt, Occupy Wall Street, and also trending topics on the platform. Some of these are parts of larger projects, and I'm also working on a book off of this, so there's not enough time to cover all of that today. I'm just going to focus on our work on Egypt and this particular study, the top one there, on effective news and networked publics. So for this particular study, we were interested in Twitter as a platform for news storytelling, enabling collaborative story writing, co-creation of news, but in most cases enabling collaborative filtering and collaborative curation of news stories. And so for this particular study, we were interested in the form, the shape that news took on as it was broadcast to the rest of the world through the platform of Twitter. We wanted to get a sense for the news values that characterize the stream. We utilized John Hartley's definition of news values as the things that turn events into stories. This is his typology of the kinds of things that these values represent, reflect. We use this typology because it's comprehensive and inclusive of all previous work, but also inclusive of Western and non-Western paradigms for journalism. And then we also wanted to, we took a cue from Barnhurst and Neron's work on the form of news as specific to sociocultural context. We wanted to examine the feel, the shape, the texture of the particular news stream that we were interested in. We gathered a totality of 1.5 million multilingual tweets from the tag Egypt, period ranging from January 23rd to February 24th. We did some frequency analysis for this study using R, computerized content analysis, semantic, and also looking at adversity markers and who they were pointing at. And then we also worked with a subsample that we discourse analyzed. We did some more qualitative work on. What did we find? In terms of news values, a lot of the old or conventional news values were there, the things that we expect define newsmaking, news reporting. So a large scale of events, closeness to home, clarity of meaning, short time scale, relevance, consonance, personification, significance, drama, action, all of that was there. The last value I want to focus on is this idea of ambience. And we use the term ambience to talk about the constancy and continuity of an always-on news environment with a pulse of its own that's organic, that's collective. It's almost like a live news event with a life cycle of its own. So you might think of one event consisting of the activities that are going on in the ground, another event consisting of how these activities are reported through TV, yet another event consisting of the activities as broadcast via Twitter. And of course, different events lead to different experiences, different ways of experiencing and relating to what's going on. This is reflected both in the pace and the rhythm of the stream, which attains intensity during that period, during that peak, and features things that are not new news, but things that are just tweeted and then rebroadcast so as to sustain the rhythm, the pace, and the intensity of an always-on news environment, of an always-on stream. And so it is this intensity that leads us to characterize the form of news as effective. Using previous literature, we understand affect as containing pre-emotive expressions of intensity that are subjectively experienced and that are connected to processes of premediation or anticipation of events prior to the occurrence of these events. So this sort of intensity is found both in the rhythm and the pace of the storytelling on the stream, which is instant, it's emotive, it is phatic. It's also found in the repetition and mimicry that set the pace for the stream. As I mentioned, so much of this content is not new news, but repetition of the same thing, sometimes with just a very small gesture of recognition or joy or excitement, and because all of these voices are harmonizing, the effect is, or rather the stream becomes very rhythmical, very musical. You get a chant of voices that are collectively repeating the theme of a revolution. I use the metaphor of the chorus in a Greek tragedy to explain this. So the chorus in a Greek tragedy takes a couple of words or phrases and repeats them at key points to do two things: to add intensity, but also to focus the attention of the audience on one particular idea. And this is what's happening here. Finally, in terms of the form of communication, we see oral and print storytelling cultures combined. People mix traditional broadcasting practices with the conventions of interpersonal communication, reconciling what we understand as a primary orality, oral cultures of storytelling, with print cultures of storytelling, and possibly perhaps presenting a digital form of orality. The point is that news, fact, drama, opinion, and emotion blend into one to the point where it's very difficult to distinguish one from the other, and doing so misses the point. So in conclusion, what does all this mean? A, collaborative news feeds expose temporal and other incompatibilities between live tweeting the news and news reporting. These incompatibilities are not necessarily insurmountable, but they do require acknowledging the presence of many journalisms, and then also cultivating many literacies necessary in order to interpret the meaning of all of this. Or if you prefer, you might think of these as many layers to journalism. You know, we frequently talk about Twitter as a rough draft for journalism, and then journalism as a rough draft for history. There's another question, you know, this idea of leaderless publics. So there's no evidence in our research that the platform robbed the movement of its leaders. Leaders emerged through pluralized processes. They were crowdsourced to prominence. We describe these processes as a form of networked gatekeeping. And finally, on the relationship between affect and news storytelling, and affect and mobilization. So affect is not an event. It's a layer to an event. It's a way for individual citizens to find their way, to locate their place in a story, to feel their way into politics. I think what's problematic is when affect is reported as the event, as the story. Affect, you know, that kind of intensity can create feelings and can sustain feelings of community. And these feelings can either reflexively drive a movement, or they may entrap users in a state of engaged passivity. So which of the two will happen depends on sociocultural context.
I wanted to raise a few points for discussion for later on today, and make some comments about the role of social media and the pitfalls of social media with regards to understanding revolution, using Egypt in particular as a case study in that regard. We've talked a lot about it over the last couple of days. I think that people will continue talking about it for a long time to come. But my presentation will be particularly around the pitfalls of relying on it too much, and what it does and what it doesn't say. And comparing it with the street's impressions, are they going to be the same as social media audiences? And I'm going to take through the slides two particular things in order to show the intense sort of difference between what publics actually think on the ground within Egypt and what social media thinks as well. So support for protests and support for the military. If you looked at social media in Egypt, especially over the last 18 to 24 months, I think you would have a rough idea of protests being quite popular within Egypt. I think you'd find a lot of people saying that they're a great idea, that they're very needed, and so on. I think with regards to the military, you'd find an incredible amount of dissent with regards to the military. This is before President Morsi became president. I think you find a lot of people trying to get the military to stand down and draw attention to their abuses. So I want to show you, based on the data that we gathered at Gallup over 2011, 2012, how that actually plays out in public opinion, and then talk about the role that social media had in informing people in Egypt during 2011, 2012. So on social media, as I said, incredibly supportive of protests in 2012 and 2011, and incredibly anti-military in 2012. So support for the square and popularity of protests. These are the numbers. June 21 to September 2011. Do you think the following is a good thing or a bad thing for the country? Between 88 and 84% thought protests were a bad thing for the country. These numbers were not very encouraging to the activists in Egypt because from February 12th, the protest movement ceased to have much public support for protests in particular. It didn't mean that the military was completely supported across the country, but it did mean that that method of at least expressing dissent was certainly not very well supported. And I think that this is important, and I'll go into why when I give you a couple more examples. Support for the military and the military council. When Gallup polled for support of the military in 2011, the numbers were extremely high. They're extremely high. They are the lowest that they were until the military stepped down from governance was 88%. Okay, the highest was 95. It was around 90 when the attacks on Maspero, which is where a number of Coptic activists were killed and were accused of being killed by the military, it was still around 90% confidence rating. Okay, it was high. It was really high. So when activists were briefed on this sort of information in Egypt, the first thing they said is, your numbers, fine, we can't dispute your numbers, but it must be for the military as an institution, as opposed to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which leads the military. So, all right, that's a logical thing to say. So why don't we ask both of those questions in 2012 when we do it again? So we did. Do you have confidence in each of the following? How about the Supreme Armed Forces? This is painful. Okay, this was very, very painful for people to see and for activists to know about, because it meant that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces had just about the same amount of confidence in it as the military at large. The military had 89, the Supreme Council had 89, the military had 88, but statistically that doesn't make a difference. The point is that people didn't really distinguish that much between the military or the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And that's intense. Social media has a number of uses. Okay, it's useful for engaging a particular subsection of the Egyptian elite that have access to it and consider it to be trustworthy. It is probably the worst place for getting an accurate representation of Egyptian public opinion. It is a great place for getting a whole bunch of information all at once, but it's also the best place to get a whole bunch of really bad information all at once as well. So it does take you some time to understand how to verify, how to cross-check a lot of these things. But if you take that all into account, I think that social media is extremely useful. But you need to have these variables in the back of your mind and balance how you look at it. The repercussions for activism and for political activity in Egypt, I think, are very profound, because one of the biggest problems that the opposition has had in all of its varied facets and forms has been the inability to go beyond a certain portion of the Egyptian population. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because they simply don't understand the huge challenge that they have in front of them. And part of that, I think, is actually due to their reliance on social media. Because, again, when you look at social media, I think you get a very different outlook and picture as to what is actually going on in the country in terms of public opinion. And that matters to political activists. That's extremely important, to know how strong your base actually is, to understand, is your messaging actually successful? What are the things that you need to talk about? What are the things that matter the most to the broad majority of those that you're trying to reach? And finally, you do need to have a multilingual ability. We were talking about this earlier with Zizi, that a lot of the tools that exist to actually track the trends that happen in social media, they don't actually take this into account. So the information, I think you said, Zizi, that you got Latin characters, right? So Latin characters. Latin characters doesn't actually mean English, French, and so on. It can also mean Arabic, because a lot of people will tweet in Arabic using Latin characters. But then it doesn't track Arabic. You have to do that separately. So it is quite a difficult thing to do in terms of tracking how social media impressions and the perceptions of the public actually match up.
What I'll do now is I'll ask a quick question and then present three hypotheses on what I'd like to call subversion today. I have a book out this week, actually. A Cyber War Will Not Take Place, and it has one chapter on subversion. The entire book is highly driven by empirical analysis, and the subversion chapter is in some ways the exception to the rule because it's more theoretical, more conceptual, and doesn't go into a great level of detail. So I will be less detailed than the two previous speakers. If you are a subversive group or movement, for whatever your goals are, what are the downsides of using the technology? We've seen Hisham touched on a few of the downsides in an interesting way, but I'd like to get at that question more systematically, and that's where the three hypotheses come in. And I'll keep that rather short so we can go into depth in the discussion. My first hypothesis that I'd like to put forward here is that new technologies, communication technologies, have enabled a proliferation of subversive causes and ideas. So there are more ideas out there that will allow some people to say, okay, I'm joining whoever is with me on that particular one cause. It can be very, very specific. Therefore, because there are more subversive causes and ideas out there, there's a larger supply of those ideas and a more diversified landscape of subversive entrepreneurs and startups. So just to give you an example, look at the anti-globalization movement in a higher resolution, and you will find, going back to the early 2000s, and you will find back then a very great, a large diversity of causes and sub-movements under the umbrella of the anti-globalization movement. So here we have fragmentation, a high level of diversity, and different subgroups. Let me condense this into the first hypothesis. Subversive movements are more cause-driven as a result of the technology, I would venture to say, than they were in the past. Essentially, that's the long tail theorem that you may know from Chris Anderson, Wired magazine, applied to political movements. The second hypothesis that I'd like to put to you is that new technologies have made it easier to join such a specific movement, to join a subversive cause, if you like, and they also made it easier to leave, to stop your activity again. One reason for that is that you may be able to do something very easily. You know, there's a term clicktivism in the debate for that, without making a real commitment, without going anywhere, without leaving your sofa, so to speak, to use a prominent image in that debate. But also, you can do a lot by staying anonymous without revealing your identity. So that makes it easier for you to stop your activity once you said, okay, I've had enough. So the second hypothesis, again condensed into a bullet point here, is that subversion is likely to see higher levels of membership mobility than in the past. Third hypothesis, keep this short as you can see, is that technology may be enabling new forms of global participant-driven organization. There are terms like crowdsourcing for that, but it doesn't capture the full picture. So these new forms of participant-driven organization make it more difficult for subversive movements to establish organizational discipline. They make it more difficult to establish organizational control, and participant-driven organizations, that makes it also more difficult to establish real strong leadership. Leadership that also may imply control in the sense that you say, you know, doing this is not okay, stop, otherwise we're in trouble. If you're relying on membership initiatives and crowdsourcing, if you like, it's very hard to control your loose members. So lower levels of discipline, more difficult to establish leadership. I'm not disagreeing actually with Paolo's earlier presentation. There is still leadership, new forms of leadership, but these these new forms of leadership are certainly more difficult to actually run from the point of view of the leader than in the past. So what does that mean, what I just said? What are the three hypotheses, if you buy into them, actually mean? Well, it's maybe we are too focused on technology in this debate. Maybe other contextual factors are far more important. For instance, leadership. For instance, personalities. And sometimes the countermeasures that governments put into place. And I'd like to close by pointing out that here I think we're touching on one of the most crucial questions of our time. Because among the most important determining factors for success and failure of subversive movements is whether they take place in a liberal democracy or in an authoritarian context. And what I have in mind is something that may surprise you. Well, as a democracy, especially as liberal capitalist democracies in Western Europe and North America, there's a great degree of institutionalized subversion. Capitalism is predicated on the idea that you can subvert established monopolies or leaders in the business context. Democracy is predicated on the idea that you can subvert in an institutionalized way established authority and change the government peacefully. So the idea that all subversion is bad is very problematic. That's certainly not the case. Some subversive ideas are very valuable, in fact, to us, and we need to protect them. Democracy over the past couple of 100 years has grown institutions that actually do that, for instance, protect our anonymity during the act of voting. And it's entirely accepted that this has to be the case. But the technological environment that we are experiencing today, that is evolving, is posing those questions again. Where do we want to draw the line between protected anonymity and basically, where do we want to draw the line between constructive and good subversion and the regressive and bad subversion that is a problem? That question, ironically, poses itself much harsher and much more urgently in democracies than in authoritarian regimes. Because from the point of view of an authoritarian regime, all subversion is bad. From our point of view, not all of it is bad.